Hello my fellow history geeks, and welcome back to this month's video. So in today's video is another serial killer, whom you're probably familiar with. It's the Green River Killer. But before the video starts, I want to warn you guys beforehand. There are mentions of necrophilia, killing, spicy times, strangling and intercourse. If you're not comfortable with the mentionings, then please click off this video. But if you are somewhat comfortable about today's mentionings, then please continue watching. I hope that you will enjoy this video. Gary, he was born on February 18, 1949, in Salt Lake City, Utah. He was born to Mary and Thomas Ridgway. Gary was the second son out of 3. He was raised near Seattle's Pacific Highway, near a deprived neighborhood near SeaTac Airport. His home life was somewhat troublesome. His relatives had described his mother as domineering and have said that, while Gary was young, he had witnessed more than one violent argument between his parents. His father worked as a bus driver. He would often complain about the presence of spicy workers, while his mother worked as a sales clerk. And I will be referring SE workers as spicy workers, just to not get demonetized. Gary, he had a bedwetting problem until he was 13 years old. His mother would forcefully wash his genitals after every episode. He would later tell the defense psychologists that, as an adolescent, he had conflicting feelings of anger and sexual attraction toward his mother, and he fantasized about killing her. Gary is dyslexic and was held back a year in high school. When Gary was 16, he stabbed a 6-year-old boy who luckily survived the attack. Gary had led the poor boy into the woods and then stabbed him through the ribs into his liver. Gary's IQ was recorded as being in the low 80s. Gary graduated from Tyee High School in 1969 and would go and marry his 19-year-old high school girlfriend, Claudia Craig. He would go on and join the United States Navy and was sent to Vietnam, where he served on board a supply ship and saw combat. During Gary's time in the military, this activity was without protection. And the marriage between Gary and Claudia ended within a year. When Gary returned from Vietnam, he got a job painting trucks, which he kept for 30 years. When questioned about Gary after his arrest, friends and family described him as friendly but strange. His first 2 marriages, which resulted in divorce of infidelity by both partners. Gary's second wife, Marcia Winslow, who claimed that he had placed her in a chokehold. Gary became religious during his second marriage, proselytizing door to door, while reading the Bible aloud at work and at home. But despite his beliefs, Gary continued to solicit the services of spicy workers and wanted his wife to participate in spicy time in public and inappropriate places, and sometimes even in areas where his victims' bodies were later discovered. While according to women in his life, Gary had an insatiable sexual appetite. His 3 ex-wives and several ex-girlfriends reported that he demanded spicy time from them several times a day. He would often want to have a spicy time in public areas and even in the woods. Gary admitted to having a fixation with spicy workers, with whom he had a love/hate relationship. He would frequently complain about their presence in his neighborhood, but he did also take advantage of their services regularly. In a statement read at his plea hearing, Gary said he hated prostitutes and didn't want to pay them for spicy time. There are some who speculated that Gary was torn between his lusts and his staunch religious beliefs. And with his second wife Marcia, Gary had a son. Gary's killings began in 1982, when young runaways and prostitutes began disappearing from State Route 99 in South King County, Washington. Gary was believed to have murdered at least 71 teenage girls and women near Seattle and Tacoma, Washington. In the court statements, Gary was later reported that he had killed so many that he lost count. The majority of the murders occurred between 1982 and 1984. The victims were believed to be either spicy workers or runaways, whom he would pick up along the Pacific Highway south. Gary sometimes showed the women a picture of his son, to trick them to trust him. They would engage in sexual activity. After minutes of intercourse from behind, Gary would wrap his forearm around the front of their necks and use the other arm to pull back as tightly as he could, to strangle them. He would kill most of his victims in his own home, his truck, or even a secluded area. Most of their bodies were dumped in wooded areas around the Green River, Seattle, Tacoma International Airport, and others were dump sites within South King County. There were 2 confirmed and another 2 suspected victims found in the Portland, Oregon, area. The bodies were often left in clusters, sometimes posed. The bodies would usually be nude. Sometimes he would return to the victims' bodies and engage in necrophilia with their bodies. Gary later explained that he didn't find necrophilia more sexually satisfying, but having sex with the deceased reduced his need to obtain a living victim and thus limited his exposure to being caught. Gary would occasionally contaminate the dump sites with gum, cigarettes, and written materials belonging to other people, and to confuse the police even more, he would even transport a few of his victims' remains across state lines into Oregon. It was children who had found Gary's first victim. They found Wendy Caulfield, who was 16 at the time of her death. She was found floating in Seattle's Green River. There was a unique kind of spray paint that was found on clothing which was wrapped around the victim's neck, but unfortunately the paint wasn't tested for 20 years. But if it had been tested at the time, it would have been much easier to link the murder to Gary. On August 15, 3 more bodies were found. Detective David Reichert was one of the first authorities to arrive at the scene. Marcy Chapman, who was 31 at the time of her death. She was found in the shallow water alongside the naked body of Cindy Hines. She was 17 at the time of her death, and nearby in the undergrowth lay the body of Opal Mills, who was 16 at the time of her death. Her blue pants were knotted around her neck, her breasts were exposed, and bruises were visible on her arms and her legs. After the bodies of the victims were found, the King County Sheriff's Office formed the Green River Task Force to investigate the murders. The task force members included Robert Keppel and Dave Reichert. But the body count only rose, as more victims were discovered along the river and in the area around the Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. Gary would get arrested in 1982 on charges related to prostitution. Over the next 2 years, Gary would sexually assault and murder more than 40 other women. Every time you found a body, it was like being hit on the head with a baseball bat, Reichert told Time magazine. In spring of 1983, a prostitute named Marie Malvar, who was 18 at the time. Her boyfriend and her pimp later found a truck in front of Gary's house, which they thought was the same one that Marie had boarded the same day that she went missing. She was last seen by her boyfriend getting into a pain-patched pickup with a dark-haired man, who was about 30 to 40 years old. And 4 days later, the police would question Gary at his home about his knowledge of Marie, whom he denied knowing. In November that same year, the police would once again speak to Gary about the murders, to which he denied any knowledge about the victims. And the authorities lacked evidence to connect Gary to any of the murders. In 1984, he was already a person of interest due to his known association with the area of prostitutes. Gary contacted the police with the supposed intention of assistance. Gary would go on and get interviewed in conjunction with that event, and the police received several other tips that mentioned him. He passed a polygraph test, in which he denied killing any women. Around 1985, Gary began dating Judith Mawson, who became his third wife in 1988. Judith claimed in a 2010 television interview that when she moved into his house, while they were dating, there was no carpet. The detectives later told her that Gary had probably wrapped a body in the carpet. In the same interview, she would describe how he would leave for work early in the morning some days, probably for the overtime pay. With the few reliable leads that the police had in the Green River case, the authorities were desperate for any information to further the investigation. And having read about the ongoing case in the press, the convicted serial killer Ted Bundy wrote to Reichert, offering his help in the case. Reichert then flew to Florida, where Bundy was being held on death row. During the discussion, Ted also suggested that the killer was revisiting the dump sites to have a spicy time with his victims, which actually turned out to be true, and if the police found a fresh grave, then they should stake it out and wait for Gary to come back. Also contributing to the investigation was FBI Special Agent John E. Douglas, who developed a profile of the suspect. Judith speculated that he must have committed some of the murders while supposedly working these early morning shifts. She claimed that she had not suspected Gary's crimes, not before she was contacted by the authorities in 1987, and hadn't even heard of the Green River Killer before that time, since she wasn't watching the news. Gary said that while he was in a relationship with Judith, his kill rate went down and that he truly loved her. Out of his 49 known victims, there were only 3 that were killed after he married Judith. Judith told a local television reporter, "I feel I have saved lives by being his wife and making him happy. That's kinda sweet. Not gonna lie." In April 1987, police took hair and saliva samples from Gary. The samples collected were later subjected to DNA profiling, which provided the evidence for his arrest warrant. Since he was the last person allegedly seen with two of the victims, the police eventually searched his home and vehicles in 1987, making the connection with the murders. It was at that time that Gary finally provided police with a saliva sample that later tied him to the crimes that he had committed. But unfortunately for the police, the DNA testing at the time was insufficient, which meant that Gary remained a free man for more than a decade. With the new techniques in forensic testing at their disposal, investigators re-examined evidence from across the years the killer had been active. It was a last-ditch effort. Beverly Himmick, a Washington State Patrol Crime Laboratory forensic scientist, told the New York Times, "We didn't have a lot to work with, but we went through a lot of evidence again. We rinsed all the fingernails to look for trace evidence and swabbed the ligatures for cellular material. With one girl, we were able to find a few sperm clinging to her pubic hair." New DNA profiles from the three victims were compared with Gary's thanks to the saliva sample that he had provided in 1987. And it was a match in all three cases. On November 30, 2001, he was at the Kenworth truck factory, where he worked as a spray painter. When the police arrived to arrest him, Gary was arrested on suspicion of murdering 4 women nearly 20 years earlier after initially being identified as a potential suspect, and when the DNA evidence conclusively linked the semen that was left in the victims to the saliva swab taken by the police. The 4 victims named in the original indictment were Marcia Chapman, Opal Mills, Cynthia Hines, and Carol Ann Christensen. There were 3 more victims, Wendy Caulfield, Deborah Bonner and Deborah Estes. They were added to indictment after a forensic scientist identified microscopic spray paint spheres brand and composition of paint that was being used at the Kenworth factory during the time when these victims were killed. King County Sheriff Dave Reichert, the first officer who was assigned to the case in 1982, called a meeting to re-examine the evidence while using the newly developed DNA testing technology. The analysis produced a match between evidence from the victims and Gary. He was charged with 4 counts of aggravated murder in December 2001. He eventually pleaded guilty to 49 counts of aggravated first-degree murder. In early August 2003, the Seattle Television News reported that Gary had been moved from a maximum security cell at King County Jail to an Airway Heights minimum medium security level tank. Other news reporters stated that his lawyers, led by Anthony Savage, were closing a plea bargain that would spare him the death penalty in return for his confession to a number of the Green River murders. In 2003, Gary told the investigators that he stood against a fence during his original 1983 questioning to conceal scratches that Marie had left on his arm while she was trying to escape. Gary said that he then burned the scratches with battery acid to disguise them once the detectives had left. On November 5, 2003, Gary entered a guilty plea to 48 charges of aggravated first-degree murder as part of a plea bargain that would spare him execution in exchange for his cooperation in the location of the remains of his victims, his confession, and information. "I killed so many women I have a hard time keeping them straight," Gary said in a statement, admitting that he killed most of his victims in his house or truck before disposing of the bodies. He said that in most cases he didn't even know his victims' names. "Most of the time I killed them the first time I met them, and I do not have a good memory for their faces." Which explains why he chose the women he thought to be prostitutes, Gary did also say, were easy to pick up without being noticed. "I knew they would not be reported missing right away, and might never be reported missing. I picked prostitutes because I thought I could kill as many of them as I wanted without getting caught." Before Gary's confession, the authorities had attributed 49 murders to the Green River Killer. Gary did confess to murdering at least 71 victims. His victims were not of any specific race or ethnicity, but rather, they were all financially poor. But except for 3 of them, they were all young women and girls between the ages of 14 and 26, whom he found in vulnerable circumstances, often working as prostitutes or having run away from their homes. In his statement accompanying his guilty plea, Gary explained that he had killed all of his victims inside King County, Washington, and that he had transported and dumped the remains of the 2 women near Portland to confuse the police. Deputy Prosecutor Jeffrey Barrett noted in court that the deal contained the names of 41 victims who would not be subject of State v. Ridgway if it were not for the plea agreement. King County Prosecuting Attorney Norm Malling explained his decision to make the deal. "We could have gone forward with the 7 counts, but that is all we could have ever hoped to solve. At the end of that trial, whatever the outcome, there would have been lingering doubts about the rest of these crimes. This agreement was the avenue to the truth. And in the end, the search for the truth is still why we have a criminal justice system. Gary Ridgway does not deserve our mercy. He does not deserve to live." The mercy provided by today's resolution is directed not at Ridgway, but toward the families who have suffered so much. On December 18, 2003, the King County Superior Court Judge Richard A. Jones sentenced Gary to 48 life sentences without the possibility of parole to be served consecutively. He was also sentenced to an additional 10 years for tampering with the evidence for each of the 48 victims, which added 480 years to his 48 life sentences. He was later given another life sentence after the remains of his 49th victim were found. At the time of Gary's December 18, 2003 sentencing, the authorities had been able to find at least 48 sets of remains, including the victims that are not originally attributed to the Green River Killer. Gary did lead the prosecutors to 3 bodies in 2003. On August 16 of that same year, the remains of a 16-year-old girl was found near Enumclaw, Washington, just 40 feet from State Route 410, and were pronounced as belonging to Pammy Annette Avent, who had been believed to be a victim of the Green River Killer. The remains of Marie Malvar and April Buttram were both found in September 2003. On November 23, 2005, the Associated Press reported that a weekend hiker found the skull of one of the women that Gary had admitted murdering in his 2003 plea bargain with King County prosecutors. The skull of another victim, Tracy Winston, who was 19 when she disappeared from Northgate Mall on September 12, 1983. She was found on November 20, 2005, by a man hiking in a wooded area near Highway 18 near Issaquah, southeast of Seattle. This was the find that led to Gary's 49th life sentence. Gary confessed to more confirmed murders than any other American serial killer. Over a period of 5 months, of the police and prosecutor interviews, he confessed to 48 murders. 42 of which were on the police's list of probable Green River Killer victims. On February 9, 2004, the county prosecutors began to release the videotaped records of Gary's confession. In one of the taped interviews, he initially told the investigators that he was responsible for the deaths of 65 women. While in another taped interview, on December 31, 2003, Gary claimed to have murdered 71 victims and confessed to having spicy time with them before killing them, a detail which he didn't reveal until after his sentencing. In his confession, he acknowledged that he targeted prostitutes because they were easy to pick up, and that he hated most of them. He did also confess that he had a spicy time with his victims' bodies after he had murdered them, but claimed that he began burying the later victims so that he could resist the urge to commit necrophilia. Gary was placed in solitary confinement at Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla in January 2004. On February 18, 2011, Gary was arraigned on a murder charge at the King County Regional Justice Center in Kent, Washington, to which he pleaded guilty to in the 1982 killing of 20-year-old Rebecca Marrero. There he received his 49th life sentence in prison. Gary did previously confess to killing Marrero in his 2003 plea deal that spared him the death penalty, but the police elected not to charge him at the time because he was not able to provide the conclusive evidence. Marrero's remains were discovered in December 2010 just south of Seattle. On May 14, 2015, he was transferred to the USP Florence High, which is a high-security federal prison east of Cannon City, Colorado. In September that same year, after a public outcry and discussions with Governor Jay Inslee, the Corrections Secretary Bernie Warner announced that Gary would be transferred back to Washington to be easily accessible for any open murder investigations. He was returned by chartered plane to Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla from USP Florence High on October 24, 2015. In 2020, the police identified 14-year-old Wendy Stevens as Gary's youngest known victim. Wendy had run away from her home in August 1983, and her remains were discovered from a swamp behind a baseball field the following year. In 2023, the remains that were formerly known as Bones 17, discovered in 1985, were identified as belonging to murder victim Lori Ann Raspotnik, who had disappeared from Seattle in 1982. December 19, 2023, the King County Sheriff's Office identifies the remains of one of Gary's victims, which was previously only known as Bones 17, which belongs to Lori Ann Raspotnik with the help of DNA testing. Lori ran away from her home in nearby Lewis County at the age of 15 in 1982, and she was never seen again. Her remains were one of two sets that was discovered in Auburn, Washington, in 1985. Gary had told the authorities that years later in 2002, he had placed two of his victims in the same area. In September of this year, 2024, Gary was briefly transferred from the Washington State Penitentiary to the King County Jail for a few days, before he got transferred back to Washington State Penitentiary. The authorities refused to give any explanation for the transfer. Till this day today, he's still in prison, where he will be for the rest of his life. I hope you liked today's video, and if you do, please like and subscribe for more content like this. And if you have any story that you want me to cover, then please let me know down in the description box down below. I will see you all in my next video.
Bye!